Marcus Thompson had served as a royal guard for 12 years. His tall frame and stern expression commanded respect wherever he walked. The crisp blue uniform with golden buttons and the ceremonial sword at his side marked him as one of the elite, protectors of the royal family. But today, Marcus wasn't standing at palace gates or escorting dignitaries. Today, he sat in the back row of Courtroom 7, his calloused hands folded tightly in his lap. The courthouse buzzed with morning activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, defendants whispered nervously to their attorneys, and court clerks prepared for another day of legal proceedings. Marcus felt completely out of place among these people who spoke in legal terms he barely understood. He had never imagined he would need to be here, fighting for something so personal and precious. 6 months earlier, Marcus's world had been turned upside down. His younger sister Sarah had died in a car accident, leaving behind her 7-year-old daughter Emma. Sarah had always been the smart one in the family, the one who went to college while Marcus chose military service. She had worked as a teacher and raised Emma as a single mother after her husband left when Emma was just 2 years old. Marcus remembered the day. Sarah had asked him to be Emma's guardian if anything ever happened to her. They were sitting in her kitchen, watching Emma play in the backyard. Sarah had been unusually serious that day, talking about wills and custody papers. Marcus had laughed it off, telling her she was too young to worry about such things. Now he wished he had paid more attention to the legal documents she had tried to show him. After Sarah's funeral, Marcus had naturally assumed Emma would come live with him. He had already started converting his spare room into a bedroom for her, painting the walls pink and buying a small bed with butterfly sheets. Emma seemed to like the idea too. She had always called him Uncle Mark and would run to him whenever he visited, climbing onto his shoulders and begging for piggyback rides. But Sarah's former mother-in-law, Mrs. Patricia Whitman, had other plans. Despite the fact that her son had abandoned his family years ago and never paid child support, she filed for custody of Emma. Mrs. Whitman was wealthy, living in a mansion in the affluent part of town. She hired the most expensive lawyer money, could buy and claim that a single man with a dangerous job was no suitable guardian for a young girl. Marcus had tried to handle the situation on his own at first. He visited several lawyers, but their fees were far beyond what he could afford on a guard's salary. The few who offered to work with him seemed inexperienced and overwhelmed by Mrs. Whitman's legal team. Time was running out, and Marcus was representing himself in court, armed with nothing but determination and a deep love for his niece. The courtroom began to fill as 9 a.m. approached. Marcus watched as Mrs. Whitman entered with her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Richard. Sterling, who commanded attention with his expensive suit and confident stride, Mrs. Whitman looked every inch the proper grandmother in her pearl necklace and tailored dress. She glanced at Marcus with a look that clearly said she thought he didn't belong there. Emma sat in the front row with a social worker, her small legs swinging from the bench. She kept turning around to look at Marcus, giving him small waves when the adults weren't watching. The sight of her in that courtroom, looking confused and scared, made Marcus's chest tighten with anger and determination. Judge Harrison Mitchell entered the courtroom. Everyone rose. Judge Mitchell was known throughout the legal community as a no-nonsense man who ran his courtroom with strict rules and little patience for those who wasted his time. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His reputation was that of someone who favored wealthy, well-represented parties, and had little sympathy for those who couldn't afford proper legal counsel. As the proceedings began, Sterling immediately took control of the courtroom. He painted a picture of Mrs. Whitman as the ideal guardian, financially stable, experienced in raising children, and able to provide Emma with educational opportunities and social advantages that Marcus could never offer. He spoke eloquently about the importance of stability and proper female influence in a young girl's life. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't used to public speaking, especially not in such a formal setting. He began to tell the judge about his relationship with Emma, about how Sarah had wanted him to care for her daughter, and about the plans he had made for their future together. But Judge Mitchell seemed distracted, barely looking up from his papers as Marcus spoke. When Marcus tried to explain that he had been Emma's primary male role model since her father left, Sterling objected, claiming it was irrelevant. Judge Mitchell sustained the objection without even considering Marcus's point. The hearing continued with Sterling presenting financial documents showing Mrs. Whitman's wealth and stability, while Marcus struggled to explain his own situation. Without proper legal terminology, every time he tried to speak from his heart about his love for Emma, he was cut off by legal procedures he didn't understand. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that Judge Mitchell had already made up his mind. His questions to Mrs. Whitman were gentle and supportive, while his interactions with Marcus were curt and dismissive. The other people in the courtroom began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the unfairness of the situation. Marcus felt his hopes slipping away with each passing minute. This wasn't about what was best for Emma. It was about money, status, and legal maneuvering. He thought about all the times Emma had fallen asleep in his arms during movie nights, all the scraped knees he had bandaged, all the bedtime stories he had read to her. None of that seemed to matter in this cold, formal room where everything was decided by rules and procedures rather than love and family bonds. As the morning session continued, Marcus watched helplessly as Sterling methodically destroyed his case. The expensive lawyer had done his homework, digging up every detail about Marcus's life that could be twisted to make him look unsuitable as a guardian. Sterling mentioned Marcus's overnight shifts at the palace, questioning how he could provide proper supervision for a school-aged child. Brought up Marcus's military background, suggesting that someone trained in combat might not have the gentle temperament needed to raise a young girl. Marcus wanted to object, to explain that his military training had taught him discipline, responsibility, and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But every time he tried to speak, Judge Mitchell would wave him down, or Sterling would raise another objection that was promptly sustained. The most painful moment came when Sterling called Emma to the witness stand. The 7-year-old looked terrified as she was sworn in, her small voice barely audible as she promised to tell the truth. Sterling's questions were carefully crafted to make it seem like Emma barely knew Marcus, focusing on how often he visited and whether she felt comfortable in his small apartment. Emma's answers were honest but devastating to Marcus's case. She admitted that Uncle Mark only visited once or twice a month because he worked a lot. She said his apartment was smaller than Grandma Whitman's house, and that he didn't have a backyard like Mommy's house did. When Sterling asked if she would miss her friends at her current school, Emma nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. Marcus felt his heart breaking as he watched Emma struggle with questions designed to trap her. She kept looking at him with confusion, not understanding why these adults were asking her such difficult questions. When Sterling asked if she thought Uncle Mark could take care of her the way her mommy did, Emma hesitated, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of the question. Judge Mitchell seemed moved by Emma's testimony, but not in the way Marcus had hoped. The judge's expression softened when he looked at Mrs. Whitman, as if he saw her as the obvious solution to this child's needs. When Marcus tried to cross-examine Emma, hoping to show their close relationship, Judge Mitchell limited his questions and eventually cut him off entirely. During the lunch break, Marcus sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, his head in his hands. Few supporters had come, his fellow guards from the palace, and some of Sarah's teacher friends, but their presence only reminded him of how outmatched he was in this legal battle. Mrs. Whitman's side of the courtroom had been filled with well-dressed character witnesses. While Marcus's supporters looked out of place in their work clothes and casual attire, one of Sarah's friends, a teacher named Janet, sat down beside him. She had known Sarah since college and had watched Emma grow up. Janet had tried to testify about Sarah's wishes regarding Emma's custody, but Sterling had successfully argued that her testimony was hearsay and inadmissible. "This isn't right, Marcus," Janet said, her voice filled with frustration. "Sarah made it clear to all of us that she wanted you to raise Emma if anything happened to her. We all knew that. But somehow, none of our testimony seemed to matter." Marcus nodded, still staring at the ground. "I don't understand how this works," he admitted. "I thought courts were supposed to care about what's best for the child. But it feels like they only care about who has more money and better lawyers." They sat there. Other courthouse visitors began to gather around them. Word had spread about the custody battle, and people were taking notice of the unfair proceedings. Some were parents themselves, others were court employees who had witnessed similar injustices. They spoke in hushed tones about Judge Mitchell's obvious bias and Sterling's ruthless tactics. An elderly man named Robert, who had been observing the trial, approached Marcus. Robert explained that he was a retired social worker who had spent 40 years dealing with custody cases. His weathered face showed deep concern as he spoke. "Son, I've seen a lot of custody battles in my time. But what's happening in there isn't about the child's best interests," Robert said. "That judge has already made up his mind based on bank accounts and social status. Your little girl is going to suffer for it." The afternoon session began with character witnesses for Mrs. Whitman. Sterling paraded a series of impressive individuals before the court: the president of the country club, the headmistress of an exclusive private school, a family doctor, and several society ladies who vouched for Mrs. Whitman's character and parenting abilities. Each witness painted a picture of Mrs. Whitman as the ideal grandmother, emphasizing her financial stability, social connections, and ability to provide. Emma, with the finest education and opportunities, they spoke about the benefits of growing up in their affluent community, attending the best schools, and being part of their social circle. Judge Mitchell listened attentively to each testimony, asking thoughtful questions and nodding approvingly. When Marcus tried to cross-examine these witnesses, asking about their actual relationship with Emma or their knowledge of what Sarah had wanted for her daughter, his questions were often ruled irrelevant or argumentative. The contrast was stark. When Marcus's witnesses took the stand, his fellow guards spoke honestly about his character and dedication. But their working-class background seemed to diminish their credibility in Judge Mitchell's eyes. Sarah's teacher friends testified about her wishes for Emma's custody, but their testimonies were constantly interrupted by Sterling's objections. The most heartbreaking moment came when Marcus's supervisor from the Palace Guard took the stand. Captain Williams was a decorated veteran who had known Marcus for over a decade. He spoke about Marcus's reliability, his protective instincts, and his genuine love for Emma. He mentioned how Marcus had requested scheduled changes to spend more time with his niece after Sarah's death, and how he had already begun making arrangements to transfer to a position with more regular hours. But Judge Mitchell seemed unimpressed. When Captain Williams mentioned that the royal family themselves had spoken highly of Marcus's character, Sterling objected that celebrity endorsements were irrelevant to parenting ability. Judge Mitchell sustained the objection and instructed the jury to disregard the comment. As the day wore on, the packed courtroom began to murmur with discontent. The unfairness of the proceedings was becoming obvious to everyone present. Marcus's supporters grew more vocal in the hallway during breaks, expressing their outrage at what they were witnessing. Mrs. Whitman seemed increasingly confident as the day progressed. She smiled graciously at the judge and nodded approvingly at Sterling's performance. During one break, Marcus overheard her telling Sterling that she was already making arrangements to enroll Emma in private school and had hired a nanny to help with the transition. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Mrs. Whitman wasn't just fighting for custody, she was already planning Emma's entire future without any input from him or consideration of what Emma actually wanted. This was about possession and control, not love or family bonds. By the second day of the hearing, word had spread throughout the community about the unfair custody battle taking place in Courtroom 7. Local news reporters had picked up the story, and the courthouse hallways buzzed with conversations about the royal guard fighting for his niece against a wealthy socialite. Public opinion was clearly on Marcus's side, but inside the courtroom, Judge Mitchell seemed determined to ignore the growing concern. Marcus arrived early that morning, hoping to have a few moments to collect his thoughts before the proceedings began. He found the courtroom already filling with supporters, not just his friends and Sarah's colleagues, but strangers who had heard about his case and wanted to show their support. The gallery was packed with people from all walks of life, united by their sense of justice and fairness. Emma was already seated in the front row with her social worker, looking even smaller and more confused than the day before. She had cried herself to sleep the night before, according to the social worker, asking repeatedly when she could go home and why everyone was so angry. The sight of her distress only strengthened Marcus's resolve to fight for what he knew was right. Judge Mitchell entered the courtroom and immediately noticed the crowd. His expression darkened as he saw the number of observers, and he made a point of reminding everyone about proper courtroom behavior and his authority to remove disruptive individuals. The message was clear. He would not tolerate any interference. With his proceedings, Sterling began the day by calling Mrs. Whitman to the stand. She took her place with practiced elegance, her expensive clothing and jewelry making a clear statement about her social status. Under Sterling's gentle questioning, she painted herself as the perfect grandmother, loving, stable, and capable of providing Emma with every advantage in life. Mrs. Whitman spoke about her plans for Emma's education, describing the prestigious private school she had already contacted and the tutors she was prepared to hire. She mentioned the cultural opportunities available in her social circle: ballet lessons, piano instruction, riding lessons at the country club. Her voice was warm and convincing as she described the bedroom she had prepared for Emma, complete with custom furniture and expensive toys. But when Marcus stood up to cross-examine her, the facade began to crack. His questions were simple and direct, focusing on her actual relationship with Emma rather than her ability to provide material advantages. Marcus asked about Emma's favorite bedtime story, her best friend's name, and what she liked to do on weekends. Mrs. Whitman's answers were vague and uncertain, revealing that despite her claims of grandmotherly love, she barely knew the child. She was fighting to custody. The most telling moment came when Marcus asked about Emma's father, Mrs. Whitman's own son. Her face tightened as she was forced to admit that her son had abandoned his family, never paid child support, and had not contacted Emma in over 2 years. When Marcus asked if she had ever criticized her son's behavior or tried to force him to take responsibility for his daughter, Mrs. Whitman became defensive and evasive. "Your son walked away from his responsibilities as a father," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "He left Sarah to raise Emma alone, struggling to pay bills and work full-time while caring for a small child." "Where were you then, Mrs. Whitman? Where was this grandmotherly concern when Emma needed it most?" Sterling objected immediately, claiming the questions were irrelevant and inflammatory. Judge Mitchell sustained the objection and warned Marcus to focus on relevant matters. But the damage was done. The courtroom had heard the truth about Mrs. Whitman's selective concern for her granddaughter. Marcus continued his questioning, asking about Mrs. Whitman's work schedule and how she planned to care for Emma personally, rather than relying on hired help. Again, her answers revealed the gap between her promises and reality. She admitted that she planned to hire a full-time nanny and that her busy social calendar would require significant help with childcare. "So Emma would be raised primarily by employees rather than family?" Marcus asked. "I would provide supervision and guidance," Mrs. Whitman replied stiffly. "The same kind of supervision and guidance you provided your son?" The courtroom erupted before Sterling could object. Judge Mitchell banged his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the courtroom. But the point had been made. Mrs. Whitman's composure had cracked. Her true motivations were becoming clear to everyone present. During a brief recess, Marcus noticed that several court employees were whispering among themselves and looking at Judge Mitchell with disapproval. Even the court reporter, who had maintained professional neutrality throughout countless cases, seemed troubled by what she was witnessing. When the session resumed, Sterling called his final witness, a child psychologist who had been paid to evaluate the case. Dr. Patricia Reynolds was an impressive woman with extensive credentials, but her testimony felt rehearsed and detached from the reality of Emma's situation. She spoke in clinical terms about the benefits of financial stability and educational opportunities, making it sound as if love and family bonds were secondary considerations. Dr. Reynolds had spent exactly 1 hour with Emma, conducting a brief interview in her office. Based on this minimal interaction, she concluded that Emma would benefit from the structure and opportunities that Mrs. Whitman could provide. When Marcus questioned her about the importance of maintaining family connections and honoring a mother's wishes, Dr. Reynolds dismissed these concerns as emotional factors that should not override practical considerations. The psychologist's testimony was particularly damaging because of her professional credentials. Judge Mitchell listened carefully to her recommendations, nodding approvingly as she outlined the advantages of placing Emma with Mrs. Whitman. The judge's questions were respectful and thorough, in sharp contrast to his dismissive treatment of Marcus's witnesses, but Marcus had done his homework too. During his cross-examination of Dr. Reynolds, he revealed that she had been hired exclusively by wealthy clients in custody disputes and had never recommended that a child remain with a less affluent family member. He pointed out that her brief interaction with Emma had taken place in an intimidating office setting. It's hardly conducive to understanding the child's true feelings and needs. Most importantly, Marcus revealed that Dr. Reynolds had never spoken to him directly, never visited his home, and had made no attempt to understand his relationship with Emma or his plans for her care. Her evaluation was based entirely on financial documents and a single conversation with Mrs. Whitman. "Doctor, you've testified that financial stability is the most important factor in determining Emma's placement," Marcus said. "But have you considered that emotional stability might be equally important? Have you thought about what it means to take a child away from the only family member she has left who truly knows and loves her?" Dr. Reynolds looked uncomfortable as she admitted that she had not thoroughly investigated Marcus's background or his relationship with Emma. Her professional veneer began to slip as Marcus's questions revealed the superficial nature of her evaluation. The afternoon session was supposed to conclude the witness testimony, but Marcus could see that Judge Mitchell was preparing to make his ruling. The judge's body language and comments throughout the day had made his intentions clear. He was going to award custody to Mrs. Whitman, despite the obvious flaws in her case and the strong opposition from the community. As Judge Mitchell prepared to deliver his ruling, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Marcus sat in his chair, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Around him, the packed gallery held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness a grave injustice. Emma sat in the front row, drawing pictures on a piece of paper the social worker had given her, unaware that her entire future was about to be decided by a man who had barely acknowledged her presence during the proceedings. Judge Mitchell cleared his throat and began organizing his papers, a sure sign that he was ready to make his pronouncement. His expression was stern and confident, showing no sign that he had any doubts about his decision. Sterling leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile, while Mrs. Whitman adjusted her pearls and prepared to accept what she clearly saw as her inevitable victory. "Before I render my decision in this custody matter," Judge Mitchell began, his voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom, "I want to address the unusual amount of public interest this case has generated. While I appreciate the community's concern for the welfare of this child, I must remind everyone that custody decisions are made based on legal standards and the best interests of the child, not on popular opinion or emotional appeals." Marcus felt his heart sink. The judge's words made it clear that he had dismissed all the community support and was preparing to award custody to Mrs. Whitman based solely on her financial advantages. Marcus thought about Emma's drawings on the refrigerator at home, about the bedtime stories they shared, about all the ways he had planned to honor Sarah's memory by raising her daughter with love and care. But as Judge Mitchell continued speaking, something unexpected happened. A commotion arose at the back of the courtroom as the heavy wooden doors opened, and several people entered. Marcus turned to see who was arriving so late in the proceedings. In his breath caught in his throat, walking down the center aisle with quiet dignity was Her Royal Highness Princess Catherine, accompanied by 2 senior members of the royal household. The princess was known for her advocacy work with children and families, and her presence in the courtroom sent a shockwave through everyone present. Even Judge Mitchell stopped speaking, clearly surprised by this unexpected development. "Princess." Catherine took a seat in the gallery, her simple but elegant presence commanding immediate respect. She nodded politely to Judge Mitchell, but made no effort to draw attention to herself. Behind her sat Lord Chancellor Sir William Harrison and Lady Margaret Thornfield, both senior advisors to the royal family and respected legal experts in their own right. The judge seemed momentarily flustered by the royal presence, but quickly regained his composure. "Your Royal Highness," he said with a slight bow, "while we are honored by your presence, I must continue with the proceedings at hand." Princess Catherine smiled graciously and nodded for him to proceed. But her presence had fundamentally changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Suddenly, Judge Mitchell's biased proceedings were taking place under the watchful eyes of people who represented the highest levels of British society and legal expertise. Sterling whispered urgently to Mrs. Whitman, clearly concerned about this unexpected development. Mrs. Whitman's confident expression had been replaced by one of uncertainty as she realized that her case was now being observed by individuals who could not be impressed by her wealth or social connections. Judge Mitchell attempted to continue with his prepared ruling, but his words seemed forced and less confident than before. In considering this custody matter, I have evaluated the testimony and evidence presented by both parties. The court must consider factors such as financial stability, educational opportunities, and the ability to provide proper care and supervision for the child. As he spoke, Marcus noticed that Lord Chancellor Harrison was taking notes and whispering occasionally to Princess Catherine. Their expressions grew increasingly concerned as Judge Mitchell outlined his reasoning. Clearly favored Mrs. Whitman's financial advantages over Marcus's emotional bond with Emma. But the most powerful moment came when Emma herself reacted to the royal presence. The 7-year-old had been quietly drawing, but when she looked up and saw Princess Catherine, her face lit up with recognition. Emma had seen the princess on television and in picture books, and like many children, she was fascinated by royalty. Princess Catherine noticed Emma's attention and gave her a warm smile and a gentle wave. This simple interaction seemed to remind everyone in the courtroom that at the center of all these legal proceedings was a small child, whose life was being decided by adults she barely knew. Judge Mitchell continued his ruling, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. While Mr. Thompson clearly cares for the child, the court must consider practical matters such as housing, education, and long-term stability. Mrs. Whitman's resources and experience make her better equipped to provide for Emma's needs. As these words echoed through the courtroom, Lord Chancellor Harrison stood up slowly. His movement was deliberate and commanding, immediately drawing everyone's attention. Sir William Harrison was a man whose legal expertise was legendary, and his decision to interrupt court proceedings was unprecedented. "Your Honor," Lord Chancellor Harrison said in a clear, authoritative voice, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there are several important legal matters that may not have been properly considered in this case." Judge Mitchell looked stunned. Having a Lord Chancellor interrupt his proceedings was beyond his experience, and he struggled to maintain his composure. "Lord Chancellor, while I respect your position, this court has followed proper procedures in evaluating this custody matter." "Afraid I must disagree, Your Honor," Harrison replied calmly. "As I understand it, Mr. Thompson is representing himself in this matter. Certain fundamental rights and procedures may not have been properly explained to him." The courtroom was completely silent as everyone realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sterling looked pale, clearly understanding that his carefully orchestrated victory was about to be challenged by one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. Harrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. "In particular, I note that Mr. Thompson may not have been properly informed of his right to request a thorough investigation of both parties' backgrounds, including any history of neglect or abandonment of parental responsibilities." Mrs. Whitman shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Harrison's words hit their mark. The reference to abandonment was clearly directed at her son's desertion of his family. It's a fact that had been minimized during the proceedings. Judge Mitchell tried to regain control of his courtroom. "Lord Chancellor, I assure you that all proper procedures have been followed. The court has considered all relevant factors in determining what is best for the child." But Harrison was far from finished. Next words would change everything in the courtroom and expose the fundamental flaws in Judge Mitchell's handling of the case. Lord Chancellor Harrison's presence had transformed the courtroom from a routine custody hearing into something far more significant. As he stood before Judge Mitchell, his commanding presence and legal authority created a tension that everyone could feel. Princess Catherine watched with quiet intensity, while Emma continued to draw, unaware that the most powerful legal mind in the country was about to intervene on her behalf. "Your Honor," Harrison continued, his voice measured but firm, "I have been observing these proceedings with growing concern. It appears that several fundamental legal principles have been overlooked in the rush to judgment. Most notably, the court seems to have dismissed the documented wishes of the deceased mother, without proper legal justification. Judge Mitchell's face flushed red as he realized that his handling of the case was being questioned by someone whose legal expertise far exceeded his own. Lord Chancellor, I assure you that I have carefully considered all testimony regarding the mother's wishes. However, such testimony must be weighed against practical considerations for the child's welfare. Rassin smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had spent decades dismantling weak legal arguments. Indeed, Your Honor. But the law is quite specific about the weight that must be given to a parent's documented wishes regarding guardianship. May I ask if you have reviewed the relevant statutes, particularly Section 12 of the Children's Welfare Act? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about the specific statute Harrison had referenced. Sterling frantically shuffled through his papers trying to find the relevant law, while Marcus watched in amazement as his case was being defended by one of the most respected legal minds in the country. I have, of course, considered all relevant statutes, Judge Mitchell replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Harrison nodded politely. Then you will recall that Section 12 specifically states that when a deceased parent has made clear, documented, wishes regarding guardianship, those wishes must be given primary consideration unless there is clear evidence that following them would cause immediate harm to the child. Has such evidence been presented in this case? The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the courtroom understood that Judge Mitchell was being systematically exposed for his failure to follow proper legal procedures. Mrs. Whitman looked increasingly uncomfortable as she realized that her expensive lawyer's strategy was crumbling under real legal scrutiny. Sterling finally found his voice. Your Honor, if I may, the statute the Lord Chancellor references requires documentation of the mother's wishes. We have only hearsay testimony from friends and colleagues. Harrison turned his attention to Sterling with the same calm intensity. An interesting point, Mr. Sterling. However, I believe you may have overlooked several key pieces of evidence. Mr. Thompson, do you still have your sister's personal papers? Marcus stood up slowly, still not quite believing what was happening. Yes, sir. I have her will and some other documents at home. And among those documents, do you have any letters, emails, or written communications where your sister expressed her wishes regarding Emma's care? Marcus's eyes widened as he remembered. Yes, sir. She wrote me a letter about 2 years ago asking me to promise I would take care of Emma if anything happened to her. I kept it because it was important to her that I understand how much Emma meant to both of us. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people realized that crucial evidence had been overlooked. Judge Mitchell looked stunned that such documentation existed and hadn't been properly considered. Sterling appeared genuinely shocked, clearly having failed to investigate thoroughly. Harrison continued his methodical dismantling of the case. Your Honor, it appears that documented evidence of the mother's wishes does exist and should have been given primary consideration under the law. But there is another matter that concerns me even more deeply. He paused, letting the tension build before delivering his next point. I understand that Mrs. Whitman's son, Emma's biological father, abandoned his family and has made no effort to maintain contact with his daughter. Under the Family Relations Act, specifically Section 8, any family member who has failed to meet their legal and moral obligations to a child cannot claim guardianship rights through a proxy, including a grandparent. Mrs. Whitman's face went white as she realized the implications of Harrison's words. Her entire case was based on her family connection to Emma, but that same family connection was tainted by her son's abandonment of his responsibilities. Harrison pressed his advantage. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitman's failure to intervene when her son abandoned his family, her lack of financial support during Emma's early years, and her absence during times of need raised serious questions about her commitment to the child's welfare. The law does not reward neglect, even when it is followed by sudden interest. Judge Mitchell tried to regain control of the proceedings. Lord Chancellor, while I appreciate your legal expertise, this court has the authority to make custody decisions. based on the best interests of the child. Indeed it does, Your Honor, Harrison replied smoothly. But those decisions must be made within the framework of the law, not in spite of it. The best interests standard cannot be used to override clear legal requirements or to favor wealth over family bonds without proper legal justification. Princess Catherine chose this moment to stand, her movement drawing everyone's attention. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but carried unmistakable authority. Your Honor, if I may be permitted to address the court, I have had the privilege of knowing Mr. Thompson through his service to our family. His character, dedication, and genuine love for his niece have been evident to all who have observed him. The princess's words carried weight that no amount of money could buy. Her personal endorsement of Marcus's character delivered in front of a packed courtroom is more powerful than any testimony Sterling could have purchased. She continued, more importantly, I have had the opportunity to observe Emma during her visits to public events. It is clear that she has a strong, loving bond with her uncle. To sever that connection in favor of distant relatives who showed no interest during her times of greatest need would be a tragic miscarriage of justice. Judge Mitchell found himself in an impossible position. He had clearly intended to award custody to Mrs. Whitman based on her wealth and social status, but now found himself facing opposition from the highest levels of the legal and social establishment. His bias had been exposed. His legal reasoning had been systematically dismantled. The packed courtroom watched in fascination as Marcus, a simple royal guard who had seemed so outmatched, suddenly found himself backed by the most powerful advocates in the country. But the most important moment was yet to come, as Emma herself was about to play a role that would seal her own fate. The courtroom remained tense as Judge Mitchell struggled with the impossible situation he had created for himself. Lord Chancellor Harrison's legal intervention had exposed the fundamental flaws in the proceedings, while Princess Catherine's personal endorsement had demolished any remaining credibility Mrs. Whitman might have had. But it was what happened next that would be remembered by everyone present as the most powerful moment of the entire hearing. Emma had been quietly listening to the adult conversations swirling around her, not fully understanding the legal terminology, but sensing the emotions in the room. When she heard Uncle Mark's name mentioned repeatedly and saw the stress on his face, she did something that surprised everyone. The 7-year-old stood up from her seat in the front row and walked directly to Marcus. Uncle Mark, she said in her clear, innocent voice that carried easily through the silent courtroom. Why is everyone being mean to you? Mommy told me you would take care of me if she couldn't. She said you promised. The simplicity and honesty of her words cut through all the legal complexity and social pretension that had dominated the hearing. Here was the child at the center of the case, expressing her own wishes in language that everyone could understand. Marcus knelt down to her level, his eyes filling with tears as he hugged his niece. Judge Mitchell watched this interaction with visible discomfort, realizing that his decision was being witnessed not just by legal experts and royalty, but by the very child whose life he was about to change forever. The packed gallery sat in complete silence, many wiping away tears as they witnessed the genuine love between uncle and niece. Lord Chancellor Harrison seized this emotional moment to deliver his final legal argument. Your Honor, I believe we have now heard from every relevant party in this case. We have the documented wishes of the deceased mother. We have evidence of Mr. Thompson's character and dedication. We have testimony about Mrs. Whitman's history of neglect, and most importantly, we have heard from Emma herself about her wishes and her understanding of her mother's intentions. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. The law is clear in such cases. When a parent has made documented wishes about guardianship, when those wishes align with the child's own expressed preferences, and when the proposed guardian has demonstrated both capability and genuine love, the court has no legal basis for overriding those wishes in favor of a distant relative who has shown no previous interest in the child's welfare. Sterling made one last desperate attempt to salvage his case.
Your Honor?
Mrs. Whitman can provide financial advantages and educational opportunities that Mr. Thompson simply cannot match. Surely the court must consider the child's material welfare. but Harrison was ready for this argument. Mr. Sterling, the law does not award custody based on wealth. If financial resources were the determining factor in custody cases, every child in the country could be taken from loving families and given to wealthy strangers. The law recognizes that love, stability, and family bonds are far more important than bank accounts. Princess Catherine added her voice once more. If I may, Your Honor, I have observed many children from various backgrounds through my charitable work. The children who thrive are not necessarily those with the most material advantages, but those who are raised with genuine love and strong family connections. Emma has that with her uncle. Mrs. Whitman finally spoke up, her composure cracking. Under the pressure, Your Honor, I can provide Emma with every advantage. The best schools, the finest opportunities. Surely that matters more than sentiment. Lord Chancellor Harrison turned to address her directly. Mrs. Whitman, with respect, where were these opportunities when Emma was born? Where were they when your son abandoned his family? Where were they? When Sarah struggled as a single mother? The law does not reward selective generosity that appears only when convenient. Emma, still standing beside Marcus, looked up at the judge with the directness that only children possess. Sir, I want to stay with Uncle Mark. He reads me stories and makes me pancakes shaped like butterflies. Mommy said he would keep me safe. The innocence and clarity of her statement seemed to pierce through Judge Mitchell's remaining defenses. For the first time during the entire proceeding, he looked directly at Emma as a person rather than as a legal problem to be solved. Weight of his responsibility seemed to settle on his shoulders as he realized that his decision would shape this child's entire future. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Mitchell struggled with his decision. He could feel the eyes of everyone present watching him, waiting to see if he would do what was right or continue down the path of bias, prejudice that had marked his handling of the case. Finally, he cleared his throat and began to speak. This court has heard extensive testimony and argument regarding the custody of Emma Patterson. The legal issues raised by Lord Chancellor Harrison are significant and require careful consideration. Marcus held his breath, still kneeling beside Emma with his arm around her small shoulders. The entire courtroom seemed frozen in anticipation. Upon reflection, Judge Mitchell continued, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, it appears, that certain legal requirements may not have been given proper weight in these proceedings. The documented wishes of the deceased mother, the expressed preferences of the child, and the statutory requirements regarding family abandonment are, indeed, relevant factors that must be considered. Sterling started to object, but Judge Mitchell raised his hand to stop him. Furthermore, this court recognizes that the best interests of a child cannot be determined solely by financial considerations. Family bonds, emotional stability, and genuine love are equally important factors under the law. The tension in the room was unbearable as everyone waited for the final decision. Therefore, Judge Mitchell said, his voice growing stronger, this court awards custody of Emma Patterson to her uncle, Marcus Thompson, in accordance with her mother's documented wishes and in recognition of the strong family bond that clearly exists between them. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers as people jumped to their feet in celebration. Emma hugged Marcus tightly, not fully understanding all the legal implications, but knowing that she would be staying with the person she loved and trusted most. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that his fight was over, and he had won. Princess Catherine smiled warmly and applauded, while Lord Chancellor Harrison nodded with satisfaction at seeing justice properly served. Mrs. Whitman sat in stunned silence, clearly shocked that her wealth and social connections had not been enough to overcome the law and genuine family love. As the celebration continued around them, Marcus whispered to Emma, "We're going home, sweetheart, just like Mommy wanted." The story of the royal guard who taught a judge the law spread quickly throughout the community and beyond. It became a powerful reminder that justice is not for sale, that family bonds matter more than bank accounts, that sometimes the most unlikely people can stand up to power and win when they have truth and love on their side. Marcus returned to his duties as a royal guard, but with modified hours that allowed him to be a proper guardian to Emma. The royal family's support had not only helped him win custody, but it also opened doors to better opportunities that ensured Emma would have every advantage she needed. While remaining with the family member who truly loved her, Judge Mitchell's handling of the case became a subject of review by judicial authorities, serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of following legal procedures and avoiding bias in custody matters. The case was eventually used in law schools as an example of how personal prejudice can corrupt legal proceedings and why proper legal representation matters for all parties. Emma grew up knowing that her mother's wishes had been honored and that love had triumphed over money and social status. The day her Uncle Mark taught a judge, the law became a family story that would be passed down for generations. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they fight for what is right